The Forgotten Duchess. She stood in the rain-soaked courtyard of Ashworth Manor, clutching a letter sealed with wax she thought she'd never see again. Her dead husband's crest pressed into crimson as dark as old blood. The paper trembled in her hands, not from the cold November wind, but from the impossible truth bleeding through the ink. My dearest Cecilia, I have wronged you beyond measure. What you believed for 3 years was a lie. I am alive and I am coming home. The world tilted beneath her feet. She had buried him. She had worn black until her skin seemed to absorb the color. She had become a ghost in her own home, forgotten by society, abandoned by his family, left to rot in this crumbling estate with nothing but memories of a marriage that had been cold as winter frost. And now, this? Her knees buckled, and she sank into the mud, the letter pressed against her heart, while the rain washed away 3 years of carefully constructed numbness. Wait before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. The letter bore yesterday's date, posted from Dover. He could arrive within days, perhaps hours. Cecilia Ashworth, Duchess of Thornfield, 26 years old and already a widow, or so she had believed, rose from the mud with shaking legs. Her black morning gown clung to her frame, heavy with rain and the weight of resurrection. The manor loomed behind her, its windows dark, its halls emptied of servants she could no longer afford to pay. Only Mrs. Henshaw remained, the elderly housekeeper who stayed out of loyalty rather than wages. "Your Grace!" The woman's voice carried across the courtyard, shrill with alarm. "Come inside before you catch your death." Death. The word tasted bitter now. Cecilia had courted death for 3 years, had welcomed it like a lover in the long winter nights when the cold seeped through the broken windows and the silence pressed against her skull. She had written letters to Edmund in the darkness, telling him everything she'd never said when he was alive, that she had loved him desperately, that his coldness had killed something inside her, that she forgave him for dying before they could find their way to each other. And all of it had been addressed to a ghost who walked. She moved toward the manor, her boots squelching in the mud, and climbed the stone steps that were cracked with age and neglect. Inside, the entrance hall smelled of damp and decay. The portraits of Edmund's ancestors watched her with stern disapproval from walls where the paper peeled like dead skin. Mrs. Henshaw waited with a blanket, her weathered face creased with concern. "What's happened? You look as though you've seen—" "A ghost." Cecilia's voice came out strangled. She thrust the letter toward the housekeeper. "Read it." The old woman's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. Her lips moved silently, forming the impossible words. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with shock. "But this cannot be. We buried his grace. I saw the coffin lowered into the ground." "We buried someone." Cecilia's voice was hollow. "But it seems my husband was not inside." The housekeeper crossed herself. "Mary, Mother of God! How is such a thing possible?" "I don't know." Cecilia walked to the window, staring out at the rain-drenched grounds. The gardens had gone wild, roses choking on their own thorns. Pathways vanished beneath weeds. Everything had died when Edmund did, or seemed to. But he's coming back, and when he arrives, he'll find nothing here but ruin. She thought of the debts, the creditors who circled like vultures, the cold letters from Edmund's family demanding she vacate the property so it could pass to his cousin. She had held them off with nothing but pride and the legal protection of her widowhood. But if Edmund lived... If Edmund lived, then she was still his wife, still bound to a man who had barely spoken to her during their 2 years of marriage, who had left for the continent on some mysterious business and never returned, still trapped in a union that had felt like a beautiful prison. "What will you do?" Mrs. Henshaw asked quietly. Cecilia turned from the window. Her reflection in the darkened glass showed a woman she barely recognized, too thin, too pale, with shadows beneath her eyes like bruises. The girl who had married Edmund Ashworth at 19, full of hope and romantic dreams, had died somewhere in these halls. "I will wake," she said, "and when he arrives, I will demand the truth." Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Thornfield, stood at the gates of his own estate and felt the weight of his sins settle on his shoulders like iron chains. 3 years. 3 years since he'd staged his death and fled to the continent, driven by shame and secrets he couldn't bear to confess. 3 years since he'd abandoned the only woman who had ever looked at him with something other than fear or calculation. The manor looked worse than he'd imagined. The east wing showed signs of fire damage. When had that happened? The grounds were overgrown, the fountain in the courtyard cracked and dry. And there, in one of the upper windows, he saw a flicker of candlelight. She was still here. Against all odds, Cecilia had stayed. His hand tightened on the leather satchel that contained everything he'd salvaged from his time in exile, documents that proved his innocence, letters that explained his choices, and a small velvet box holding the ring he should have given her on their wedding day, instead of the cold band of duty. "Your Grace." His manservant, Thomas, stood beside him, rain dripping from his hat. "Perhaps we should approach tomorrow in daylight." "No." Edmund's voice was rough from disuse. He'd spent 3 years in silence, hiding in monasteries and forgotten villages, speaking only when necessary. "I've delayed long enough." He pushed open the gates, they weren't even locked, and walked up the overgrown path. Each step felt like walking toward judgment. What would she say when she saw him? Would there be rage in those soft gray eyes? Relief? Or nothing at all? Just the cold emptiness he'd seen in their final months together, when he'd withdrawn so completely she'd stopped trying to reach him. He climbed the stone steps and raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles touched wood, the door flew open. Cecilia stood in the threshold, a candle in one hand and something wild in her expression, shock and fury, and something else he couldn't name. She'd changed. The softness she remembered had been carved away, leaving someone sharper, harder, forged in the fire of grief. She was magnificent. "You," she breathed, "you're real." "Cecilia, Her hand cracked across his face with a force that snapped his head sideways. The sound echoed through the empty courtyard like a gunshot. 3 years, she hissed. 3 years I mourned you. 3 years I wore black and shut myself away and let the world forget I existed. 3 years I spoke to your grave and begged God to let me join you." Her voice broke. "And you were alive." Edmund felt the sting of her palm on his cheek, welcomed it as the beginning of penance. "I know. I'm sorry doesn't begin to—" "Sorry?" she laughed, and the sound was jagged glass. "You're sorry? Do you know what I've endured? Your family tried to force me out. Creditors came for debts I didn't know existed. I've lived on scraps and charity, selling everything of value just to keep the roof from caving in. I've been alone, Edmund, completely alone. I had to." The words came out desperate. There were things happening, dangerous things, and I couldn't risk you being caught in the middle. I thought if I disappeared, if everyone believed me dead, you'd be safe." "Safe?" Her eyes flashed. "You left me to drown. You condemned me to this living death and called it safety?" Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly from behind Edmund. "Perhaps this conversation should move inside, Your Grace." Cecilia's gaze shifted to the servant, and something in her expression shifted, a flicker of the Duchess she'd once been, trained to maintain appearances even when her world was ending. "Of course. Come in." She stepped back, and Edmund crossed the threshold into his own home. The entrance hall was colder than he remembered, darker. Dust sheets covered the furniture, and there was a smell of damp that spoke of neglect. "Mrs. Henshaw," Cecilia called, her voice steady now, controlled. "We have guests. Please prepare the blue room for His Grace and arrange accommodation for his man." The housekeeper appeared from the shadows, her face pale with shock at seeing Edmund alive. She bobbed a curtsy and hurried away, muttering prayers under her breath. Cecilia led them to the library, one of the few rooms that showed signs of habitation. A small fire burned in the hearth, and there were books scattered across a reading chair, evidence of long, lonely evenings. She moved to the sideboard and poured 3 glasses of brandy with hands that shook only slightly. "Sit," she commanded, and Edmund obeyed, settling into a chair that had once been his favorite. Thomas remained standing near the door, uncertain. Cecilia handed them each a glass, then took her own and drained it in one swallow. Edmund watched her throat work as she swallowed, saw the way she closed her eyes as the liquor burned. When she opened them again, they were hard as winter ice. "Explain, and it had better be the truth, Edmund, because I will know if you're lying." He believed her. Something in her had changed, had sharpened into a blade that could cut through his excuses. So he told her everything. "My father," he began, and saw her stiffen. "Before he died, he made certain investments in a shipping company that was smuggling more than legal cargo, weapons mostly, bound for France during the war. I didn't know until after his death, when men came to our London house demanding payment for services rendered." "What kind of men?" Cecilia's voice was cold. "Dangerous ones, the kind who don't accept refusal." Edmund stared into his brandy. "They said my father owed them a fortune, and they would extract payment in blood if not in gold. They threatened you, Cecilia. They described in detail what they would do to you if I didn't cooperate." He saw her hand tighten on her glass. "I tried to handle it quietly, sold off properties, liquidated assets, but it wasn't enough. The debt was astronomical, and the deeper I dug, the worse it became. My father had been in league with some of the most ruthless criminals in Europe. And then I discovered the worst part. There was evidence, documents, that could prove the Ashworth family's involvement in treason. If those came to light, everything would be forfeit. The title, the lands, everything. And you would be dragged down with me. So you staged your death." Her voice was flat. "I arranged to go to the continent on the pretense of business. While I was away, Thomas here, he's been loyal beyond measure, arranged for a body to be placed in a carriage accident. We bought a corpse from a resurrection man, someone already dead, and made it look like I'd died in the crash. The body was too badly burned for identification, but my papers were on it." Cecilia stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "And where were you while I was burying this stranger?" "In France, hunting down every piece of evidence, paying off debts, eliminating the men who had threatened you. It took 3 years, Cecilia, 3 years of living in shadows, of tracking down every record, every witness, every thread that could unravel us. But I did it. The debt is paid, the evidence destroyed, and the men who threatened you are either dead or imprisoned." "How convenient," she said bitterly. And in all that time, in 3 entire years, you couldn't send word, couldn't let me know you were alive? If anyone knew, you would have been in danger. These weren't men who made idle threats. If they suspected you knew I was alive, they would have used you to draw me out. I couldn't risk it. She spun to face him, tears streaming down her face now, fury and pain mingling. You couldn't risk it? You couldn't risk me having hope? You left me to believe I was a widow, Edmund. Do you understand what that means? I wasn't just grieving. I was free. Free from a marriage that had been a cage. Free from a husband who looked at me like I was a duty to be endured. Her words struck him like physical blows. Cecilia! No. She held up a hand. You don't get to explain that away. Whatever danger you were protecting me from, whatever noble sacrifice you thought you were making, the truth is you left. You chose to leave rather than trust me, rather than let me stand beside you. You chose to let me suffer alone. Edmund rose from his chair, taking a step toward her, but she backed away. Don't you dare come closer. I know I hurt you. His voice cracked. I know I failed you in every way a husband can fail a wife. Our marriage was cold because I was terrified, Cecilia. Terrified of what my father had done, of the secrets I was carrying, of dragging you into darkness. I thought if I kept my distance, if I never let you get too close, you'd be safe from the poison in my family's blood. But I was already in it, she cried. The moment we married, I was part of it. Your distance didn't protect me. It just made me bear it alone. The library fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Edmund wanted to cross to her, to take her in his arms and apologize for every cold word, every distant glance, every night he'd spent in his separate chambers rather than reach for her. But he could see in the rigid line of her shoulders that she would shatter if he touched her. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "I'll do anything." She laughed again, that bitter, broken sound. "I don't know what I want. For 3 years, I've lived with your ghost. I've talked to you, argued with you, forgiven you, hated you. I made peace with your death, Edmund. I let you go. And now you're here, flesh and blood, asking me to simply take you back as though nothing happened? I'm not asking you to take me back." He set down his glass, his hands empty, open. "I'm asking for a chance to earn forgiveness, to prove that the man who returns is not the same one who left." Cecilia turned back to the window, her reflection ghostly in the dark glass. "I need time. I need to think. Tomorrow we can discuss the practical matters, the estate, your family, how we explain your resurrection to the world. But tonight," she closed her eyes, "tonight I just need you to leave me alone." Edmund bowed, a gesture of respect and acceptance. "As you wish, Your Grace." He left the library, Thomas following, and made his way to the blue room Mrs. Henshaw had prepared. It was cold and smelled of disuse, but it was better than he deserved. As Thomas helped him out of his traveling cloak, Edmund caught sight of himself in the tarnished mirror. He looked older, harder. His hair had grown long, tied back carelessly, and there was a scar along his jaw from a knife fight in Marseille. The polished Duke who had left 3 years ago was gone, replaced by something rougher. "What will you do, Your Grace?" Thomas asked quietly. Edmund stared at his reflection. "Whatever it takes to win back my wife." Cecilia didn't sleep. She sat in the library through the night, the fire burning down to embers, her mind spinning through everything Edmund had told her. Part of her understood. Part of her could even admire the sacrifice he'd made, the danger he'd faced to protect her. But another part, the part that had grieved and suffered and learned to survive without him, felt only rage. He had taken her choice away, had decided unilaterally that she was safer in ignorance, that her pain was an acceptable price for her protection. He had treated her like a child, like something fragile to be sheltered, rather than a partner to stand beside him. And yet, there was something different about him now. The cold, distant man she'd married had been replaced by someone raw, desperate. When he'd looked at her in the library, she'd seen real emotion in his eyes for the first time. Guilt and longing and fear all mingled together. It terrified her, because if he had truly changed, if the man who returned was capable of the love she'd once dreamed of, then she would have to choose whether to forgive him. And forgiveness felt like betrayal of the woman she'd become in his absence. Dawn crept through the windows, gray and cold. Cecilia rose stiffly from her chair and made her way upstairs to her chambers. In the mirror, she saw what Edmund must have seen, a woman hollowed out by grief, aged beyond her years. She stripped off her morning dress, letting it pool on the floor like shed skin. In her wardrobe hung gowns she hadn't worn in 3 years, colors she'd forbidden herself. She chose a dress of deep burgundy, the color of wine or old roses, and fastened it with fingers that remembered how to be a duchess. When she descended for breakfast, Edmund was already in the dining room, dressed simply but cleanly, looking more like the man she'd married. He stood when he entered, uncertain. "Good morning," she said formally, taking her seat at the opposite end of the long table. "Good morning." He sat only after she did. "You look beautiful." She ignored the compliment. "We need to discuss practicalities." "Of course." Mrs. Henshaw brought tea and what little food remained in the pantry, stale bread, some preserves, a bit of cheese. Cecilia poured her tea with steady hands, aware of Edmund watching her every move. "Your family believes you dead," she began. "They've been pressing me to leave so the estate can pass to your cousin Marcus. The debts you mentioned, they're still being called in by local creditors who knew nothing of your father's criminal dealings. If you simply return, there will be questions." "I know." Edmund leaned forward. "I've thought about this. We'll need to craft a story, something believable. Perhaps that I was injured in the accident, lost my memory, was cared for in some remote village until recently recovering." "Amnesia?" Cecilia raised an eyebrow. "How convenient. Do you have a better suggestion?" "She did, actually. We tell the truth, or a version of it. You discovered your father's illegal activities, went to the continent to make restitution and settle debts, and were held there by complications until now. It's close enough to the truth that you won't stumble over the lie." Edmund looked at her with something like admiration. "That's better than anything I'd considered. But it will raise questions about why you weren't informed. We say you couldn't risk correspondence being intercepted, that you asked an intermediary to inform me, but the message never arrived." She sipped her tea. "I play the surprised, devoted wife, overjoyed at your return." "And are you?" The question was soft. "Overjoyed?" Cecilia set down her cup. "I'm many things, Edmund. Overjoyed is not among them. But I am pragmatic enough to know that your return solves certain problems. The creditors can be dealt with, your family can be silenced, and perhaps we can salvage what remains of this estate. And our marriage?" The question hung in the air between them. Cecilia stood, smoothing her skirts. "Our marriage is a legal contract that apparently still stands. What it becomes beyond that remains to be seen." She walked to the door, then paused. "I've survived 3 years without you, Edmund. I learned to be strong, to stand alone, to make decisions without deferring to a husband. I won't go back to being the girl you married, quiet and obedient and willing to accept whatever crumbs of affection you offered. If you want a real marriage, you'll have to earn it. With that, she left him sitting alone at the table, her words echoing in the empty room. Over the following days, Edmund threw himself into salvaging the estate. He met with creditors, producing documents that proved his father's debts had been settled abroad. He wrote to his family, announcing his survival with the story Cecilia had crafted. He inspected every inch of the manor, cataloging the damage and planning repairs. And through it all, he watched his wife. She was extraordinary. The shy girl he'd married had been replaced by a woman who negotiated with creditors like a general commanding troops, who planned household economies with ruthless efficiency, who walked through the ruined gardens sketching restoration plans with a steady hand. She'd grown into the role he'd abandoned her to, had become the Duchess the estate needed, and he was humbled by it. But she kept him at arm's length, polite, professional, occasionally even warm when they were in company, but never alone, never unguarded. She slept in her chambers with the door locked, took her meals at times he wouldn't interrupt, and filled her days so completely there was no space for him. On the 5th day after his return, Edmund found her in the rose garden, clearing away dead growth with garden shears. Her hair had escaped its pins, curling around her face, and there was dirt on her cheek. She'd never looked more beautiful. "Let me help," he offered. She glanced up, surprised. "You're a duke. You don't do garden work." "I'm a man trying to rebuild his home." He took a pair of shears from the garden shed. "And I've learned in the past 3 years that there's no work beneath me." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. Start with those climbing roses. They've gone completely wild." They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the snip of shears and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Edmund found it peaceful, this simple labor alongside his wife. There was no tension here among the thorns and dead leaves, just the shared purpose of coaxing life from ruins. "Why roses?" he asked, eventually. "Of all the gardens to restore first, why this one?" Cecilia didn't look up from her work. "Because roses are stubborn. They'll grow in terrible conditions, survive neglect, bloom even when they shouldn't. I admire that." He heard the message beneath her words. "You're talking about yourself." "Perhaps." She moved to another bush, her movements efficient. "I learned a lot about survival in your absence, Edmund. About what it means to be alone, but not defeated. I'm sorry I left you to learn those lessons." "Are you?" She finally looked at him, her gray eyes sharp. "Because from where I stand, it seems like you made a calculated choice. You decided I would be safer in ignorance and pain than in danger at your side. And maybe you were right. Maybe I would have died if I'd known what you were facing. But you took my choice away. You decided for me." Edmund set down his shears, his hands curling into fists. "You're right, I did. And I thought I was being noble, protecting you. But the truth is, I was a coward." That got her attention. She straightened, waiting. "I was terrified of you seeing the truth," he continued, "that beneath the title and the polish, I was just a man drowning in my father's sins. I thought if you got too close, you'd see how weak I was, how much I was failing. So I pushed you away. I made our marriage cold because I was afraid of what would happen if I let you in. And now," her voice was barely a whisper, "now I know that strength isn't surviving alone. It's having the courage to let someone stand with you." He took a step toward her, closing the distance carefully. "You became strong without me, Cecilia. You survived and thrived and became magnificent. But I'd like the chance to stand beside you now, not as your protector, but as your partner." She searched his face, looking for lies or pretty words. He let her look, hiding nothing. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally. "The hurt goes too deep. You weren't just absent, Edmund. You were dead. I grieved you. I buried who I thought you were and learned to live with the ghost. And now you ask me to resurrect not just you, but our marriage, and I don't know if I have the strength for it." "Then don't," he said gently. "Don't forgive me if you can't. Don't resurrect what we had. But maybe we could build something new. Not the cold marriage we had before, but something honest, something real." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she wiped them away angrily. "You can't just come back and say the right words and expect everything to be healed." "I know. I'm not expecting anything. I'm just asking for a chance." Before she could respond, the sound of hooves on gravel drew their attention. A carriage was approaching the manor. Black and expensive, bearing a coat of arms Edmund recognized immediately. "Damn," he muttered. "Who is it?" Cecilia asked, already moving toward the house. "Marcus, my cousin." Edmund followed her, his jaw tight. "He's the one who stands to inherit if I'm dead. This won't be a pleasant reunion." They reached the front steps just as the carriage halted. Marcus Ashworth emerged, tall and handsome in an oily way, his smile sharp. Behind him came a woman Edmund didn't recognize, young, pretty, dressed in the height of fashion. "Cousin!" Marcus called out, his voice dripping false warmth. "I could scarcely believe the news. Back from the dead! It's a miracle!" "Marcus." Edmund's greeting was curt. "I wasn't expecting you." "Weren't you?" "When word reached London that the Duke of Thornfield had risen like Lazarus, I simply had to come see for myself." His gaze shifted to Cecilia, and something calculating entered his expression. "And dear Cecilia, still playing the loyal wife, I see. How touching." Cecilia's spine straightened. "Mr. Ashworth, what brings you to our home?" "Our home?" Marcus laughed. "Well, that's a matter for discussion, isn't it? You see, I've spent the past 2 years preparing to assume the title. I've made investments, taken on responsibilities, established myself as the heir. And now dear Edmund returns at the most inconvenient moment." "How inconsiderate of me," Edmund said dryly, "to not stay dead for your convenience." The woman beside Marcus cleared her throat delicately. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside." Marcus waved a hand. "Of course, how rude of me. This is Miss Beatrice Wilton, my fiancée. Beatrice, my unfortunate cousin Edmund and his wife." The slight was deliberate. Edmund felt Cecilia stiffen beside him, but when she spoke, her voice was pure aristocratic ice. "How lovely. Please, do come inside. Mrs. Henshaw will prepare refreshments." They moved to the drawing room, one of the few spaces Cecilia had managed to keep presentable. Marcus looked around with barely concealed disdain at the worn furniture and faded drapes. "Fallen on hard times, I see," he remarked, settling into a chair without being invited. "The estate looks quite shabby." "We've managed as best we could," Cecilia said coolly, taking her seat beside Edmund in a deliberate show of unity. "Without support from the family." Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, naturally, we assumed the estate would be coming to me." No point in throwing good money after bad when the title was set to change hands. "But it isn't," Edmund said flatly. "I'm alive, which means I'm still the Duke of Thornfield. The title, the estate, everything remains mine." "Does it, though?" Marcus leaned forward. "You see, there's a rather significant problem with your resurrection, cousin. You staged your death. The legal documents are quite clear. You were declared legally dead. Your wife became your widow. In the eyes of the law, you ceased to exist." Cecilia's hand found Edmund's, her fingers cold but steady. "What are you suggesting?" I'm suggesting that Edmund's return creates a legal quagmire. Is he truly the Duke, or did his legal death strip him of the title? Does it pass to me as the designated heir? And most importantly, his gaze shifted between them. Is your marriage still valid if you were declared a widow? Or would you need to remarry to re-establish the bond? The room fell silent. Edmund felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. Marcus was right. His staged death had created a legal nightmare. Furthermore, Marcus continued, clearly enjoying himself, there's the matter of fraud. You faked your death, Edmund. That's a crime. You could face prosecution, loss of title, imprisonment. Unless, of course, we could come to some arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Edmund's voice was deadly quiet. Simple. Sign over the estate to me. I'll take the title, the lands, the debts, all of it. In return, I'll smooth over the legal complications, ensure no charges are brought, and even provide you and Cecilia with a generous settlement. You could retire to the countryside, live quietly, avoid scandal. No. Cecilia's voice cut through the room like a blade. This is Edmund's home, his birthright. We won't simply hand it over because you're threatening us with legal complications. You're likely exaggerating. Marcus turned to her, his expression pitying. My dear Cecilia, I understand you feel loyal to Edmund, but surely you must see reason. The man abandoned you, faked his death, left you to suffer for 3 years. What kind of husband does that? You deserve better. In fact, he paused dramatically. I'd be willing to include in our arrangement a very generous settlement for you specifically, enough to live independently, comfortably, free from this sham of a marriage. How dare you? Edmund growled, starting to rise, but Cecilia's hand tightened on his, holding him in place. How dare I? Marcus's mask of civility slipped. How dare you, cousin? You've brought shame on this family with your schemes and lies. The kindest thing you could do now is step aside and let someone capable take over. Beatrice Wilton, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. Marcus, perhaps we should give them time to consider. No, Marcus interrupted. They need to understand the seriousness of the situation. I want an answer within a week, Edmund. Sign over the estate, or I'll bring every legal challenge I can muster. I'll drag your name through the courts, expose every sordid detail, and destroy what little reputation you have left. He stood, Beatrice rising with him. We'll be staying at the Thornfield Inn in the village. Think carefully about your choice. After they left, the drawing room felt suffocating. Edmund paced to the window, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. Is he right? Cecilia asked quietly. About the legal complications? I don't know. Perhaps. Edmund turned to face her. I didn't consider. God, I should have thought about this, about what declaring myself legally dead would mean. We need a solicitor, someone who can advise us on the law. We need more than that. Edmund ran a hand through his hair. We need proof that I had legitimate reasons for staging my death, that it wasn't fraud but necessity. We need documentation, witnesses, something to show the courts. Do you have that? Some. I have letters, records of the debts I was paying, evidence of the threats. He met her eyes. But it might not be enough. Marcus is right about one thing. This could get very ugly. Cecilia stood, moving to stand beside him at the window. Outside, the winter sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Then we fight. We fight for this estate, for your name, for our place in the world. Edmund looked down at her, surprised. You're willing to stand with me, even after everything? I'm not doing it for you, she said bluntly. I'm doing it because this is my home too. I've given 3 years of my life to keeping it standing, to holding back the creditors and the ruin. I won't let your snake of a cousin take it just because he sees an opportunity. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was partnership. It was the beginning of something real. Then we fight together, Edmund said. She nodded, then added quietly, "But Edmund, when this is over, when we've secured the estate and dealt with Marcus, we still have to deal with us, with whether this marriage can be more than just a strategic alliance." "I know, and I promise you, Cecilia, whatever happens, I won't lie to you again. I won't make decisions for you or hide things to protect you. If we're partners, we're equals." "Good." She turned back to the window. "Because I won't settle for less." The next week was a blur of legal consultations, hurried meetings with solicitors, and tense strategic planning. Edmund and Cecilia discovered that Marcus's threats, while not entirely baseless, were exaggerated. The declaration of legal death could be overturned with proper documentation and witnesses, but it would require a formal court proceeding. More problematically, Marcus had spent the past 2 years ingratiating himself with influential members of the House of Lords, spreading subtle rumors about Edmund's irresponsibility and unfitness for the title. He'd positioned himself as the reliable heir, ready to restore the Ashworth name to prominence. "He's been planning this," Edmund said, staring at the reports their solicitor had compiled. "Even before my supposed death, he was maneuvering." They were in Edmund's study, the first time Cecilia had been alone with him in such an intimate space since his return. The room smelled of leather and old books, of pipe smoke from years past. It felt like entering a memory. "He saw an opportunity and took it," Cecilia agreed. She was seated across the desk from him, papers spread between them. "The question is, how do we counter him? We need allies, people willing to speak for my character, to testify that my absence was justifiable." Edmund rubbed his temples, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "But 3 years is a long time. People forget, move on." "Not everyone." Cecilia pulled a letter from her stack of papers. "Lady Catherine Winters, do you remember her? She was kind to me after your death. She's written to say she'd be willing to testify about the threats made against your family, if needed." Edmund looked up, surprised. "Catherine? But how would she know about the threats?" "Because I told her. About a year after you died, I was at my lowest point. Considering things I shouldn't have. Catherine found me and drew the truth out of me about your coldness, about the debts, about the strange men who had come to the house before you left. She promised to help if she could." Edmund felt something crack inside his chest. "You were that desperate?" "Yes." Cecilia met his eyes without flinching. "There were days I didn't want to wake up. Days when the loneliness felt like it would swallow me whole. But Catherine helped me see that giving up would mean they won, whoever they were. So I stayed. I survived." He wanted to cross to her, to pull her into his arms and apologize for every moment of pain she'd endured. But he held himself still, respecting the distance she still needed. "I'm sorry," he said, inadequate as it was, "for all of it." "I know you are." She looked down at the papers. "But sorry doesn't fix the past. Action fixes the future. So let's focus on that." Over the next 3 days, they built their case. Lady Catherine's testimony about the threats. Thomas's detailed accounts of the criminal dealings Edmund had been trying to untangle. Letters from French authorities confirming Edmund's activities abroad. A letter from a dying man, one of the criminals Edmund had confronted, confessing to the conspiracy against the Ashworth family. It was damning, comprehensive evidence. But would it be enough? The hearing was set for 2 weeks hence. to be held before a special magistrate in London. Marcus had clearly expected Edmund to fold under pressure, because when the formal challenge was filed, his reaction was one of barely concealed fury. "He'll fight dirty now," Edmund warned Cecilia the night before they were to leave for London. "He's desperate, which makes him dangerous." They were in the library again, their unofficial meeting place. A fire crackled in the hearth, and snow was beginning to fall outside, the first of the season. Cecilia had poured them both brandy, a ritual that had become comfortable over the past weeks of preparation. "Then we'll have to be smarter," she replied. "And we have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "The truth." She smiled, small and fierce. "We're not lying or scheming. We're simply telling what happened and letting justice decide." Edmund wished he had her faith in justice. He'd seen too much of the world's darkness to believe truth always triumphed. But he didn't say so. Instead, he raised his glass. To truth, then, and to stubborn partners who refuse to give up. Cecilia clinked her glass against his. To partners. As she drank, Edmund noticed something that made his heart stutter. She wasn't wearing black anymore. Sometime in the past weeks should transition to colors. Today, it was a deep green that brought out the gray of her eyes. Tomorrow, for London, should chosen a dress of midnight blue. She was shedding her widow's weeds, emerging from mourning. But whether that meant she was ready to resurrect their marriage or simply moving on from it, he couldn't say. London in winter was a different beast from the countryside, louder, dirtier, more vibrant. Edmund had arranged for them to stay at their London townhouse, which had been closed up since his supposed death. Opening it felt like opening a tomb. "I haven't been here since the funeral," Cecilia said quietly as they stood in the entrance hall. Dust covers shrouded the furniture, and the air was stale. "I couldn't bear it. Too many memories." Edmund understood. This was where they'd lived during their brief marriage, where they'd gone through the motions of being husband and wife without ever truly connecting. He'd spent most of his time in his study, buried in his father's papers and secrets. She'd spent hers alone, planning charitable events and pretending everything was fine. "We could stay at a hotel?" he offered. "No." Cecilia pulled off her gloves. "We need to show London that we're united, that this is our home. Running away would only fuel rumors." She was right, pragmatic as always. So they stayed, enduring the ghosts of their past marriage as servants came to air out rooms and light fires in cold hearths. The hearing was scheduled for Monday. They arrived on Friday, giving them a weekend to prepare and to face the social gauntlet. News of Edmund's resurrection had spread through London society like wildfire. By Saturday afternoon, calling cards were piling up in their front hall, some genuinely curious, others clearly seeking gossip fodder. Marcus had been busy too, Edmund learned. Half of society was taking bets on the outcome of the hearing. "We need to make a public appearance," Cecilia announced over breakfast on Sunday. "Show a united front. Let people see that we're confident in our position." "Where?" Edmund asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Church, of course. And then, well, walk through the park. Very visible, very respectable." It was a brilliant strategy, Edmund had to admit. They dressed with care, Edmund in formal morning dress, Cecilia in a gown of dove gray with deep blue accents. At her throat was a necklace he'd given her on their wedding day, one she'd never worn during their marriage. "You kept it?" he said, surprised. She touched the sapphires at her throat. "It was beautiful. Just because our marriage was cold doesn't mean I didn't appreciate the gift." They walked to church together, her hand on his arm, playing the role of devoted couple. But Edmund noticed the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she smiled at passers-by. This was costing her, this performance. Church was an ordeal. Every eye was on them as they entered, whispers following in their wake. Marcus was there too, seated prominently with Beatrice, his expression one of smug satisfaction. He'd dressed for the occasion as well, looking every inch the worthy heir. The sermon was about resurrection and redemption, which Edmund felt was either divinely inspired or wickedly ironic. He could feel Cecilia trembling slightly beside him, though her face remained serene. When it was over, they processed out with the rest of the congregation, enduring the stares and barely concealed whispers. Several people approached to offer congratulations on Edmund's remarkable recovery, their eyes greedy for details. Cecilia handled them with grace, deflecting intrusive questions with practiced ease. She'd learned this, Edmund realized, learned how to navigate society's razor's edge during her time as a widow. Another skill she'd acquired in his absence. They walked through Hyde Park afterward, as planned. The winter day was crisp and clear, and the park was full of London's elite taking their Sunday stroll. More stares, more whispers, but also some genuine warmth. Lady Catherine Winters, the friend who had written to Cecilia, embraced them both with tears in her eyes. "I knew there had to be a reason," she said, loud enough for nearby observers to hear. "Edmund would never abandon Cecilia without cause." It was a masterful bit of public relations. Other sympathetic parties followed her lead, expressing their joy at the reunion. By the time they returned home, Edmund felt they'd made significant progress in the court of public opinion. But the real test would come tomorrow. That evening, as they prepared for bed in their separate chambers, Edmund found himself standing outside Cecilia's door, hand raised to knock. He wanted to thank her for the performance, for standing beside him so convincingly. He wanted to ask if any of it had been real, or if it was all strategy. But he didn't knock. Instead, he went to his own room and lay awake, thinking about the hearing tomorrow, and about the woman sleeping somewhere beyond these walls, his wife who wasn't quite his wife, his partner in resurrection who might yet choose to remain dead to him. The hearing room was smaller than Edmund expected, more intimate. A magistrate presided, flanked by 2 legal advisors. The room was filled with spectators. Marcus had ensured a good crowd, likely hoping for a public humiliation. Edmund and Cecilia sat at a table with their solicitor, Mr. Harrington, a sharp-eyed man with a reputation for winning impossible cases. Marcus and his legal team sat opposite, exuding confidence. The magistrate, Lord Justice Pemberton, called the hearing to order. "We are here to determine the validity of Edmund Ashworth's claim to the title Duke of Thornfield, given his legal declaration of death 3 years past. Mr. Ashworth, you may present your case." Mr. Harrington stood, impressive in his wig and robes. He laid out the facts clearly. Edmund's discovery of his father's criminal dealings, the threats made against his family, his desperate choice to fake his death to protect his wife and eliminate the danger. This was not fraud for personal gain, Harrington argued. This was a man making an impossible choice in impossible circumstances. He spent 3 years abroad, not in leisure, but in danger, tracking down criminals and settling debts that were not his own. He did this to protect not only his wife, but the honor of his family name. Thomas was called to testify, detailing the threats and the elaborate plan to fake Edmund's death. Lady Catherine testified about the state of fear she'd found Cecilia in, about the strange men who had come to Ashworth Manor before Edmund's departure. Then Cecilia was called. Edmund's heart clenched as she stood and moved to the witness stand. She looked small up there, delicate, but her voice was steady as she took the oath. "Mrs. Ashworth, or shall I say, Your Grace," the magistrate began. "You were informed of your husband's death 3 years ago. Can you describe the circumstances?" "I was told there had been a carriage accident on the continent," Cecilia said clearly. The body was badly burned, but identified by my husband's papers and personal effects. I had no reason to doubt it. And in the 3 years since, you maintained your position as the widow of the Duke of Thornfield? I did. I wore mourning, I managed the estate as best I could, and I honored my husband's memory. Were you aware of his survival at any point during those 3 years? No, Your Honor. The first I learned of it was when a letter arrived, posted from Dover, announcing his intention to return. And how did you feel about this revelation? Cecilia paused, and Edmund saw something flicker in her expression. Pain, anger, grief, all mingled together. When she spoke, her voice was raw. I felt as though I'd been struck by lightning. 3 years of grief, of loneliness, of learning to survive without him, and all of it had been unnecessary. I was furious, heartbroken, betrayed. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Marcus leaned forward, clearly pleased by her testimony. "So you believe your husband wronged you?" the magistrate asked. "Yes," Cecilia said. "He wronged me deeply. He made a choice that caused me immeasurable pain." She paused, then continued. "But I also believe he made that choice out of love and desperation, not malice. He thought he was protecting me. He was wrong in how he did it, but right in his intent. Some might say that staging one's death is always wrong, regardless of intent. Some might." Cecilia's chin lifted. "But those people have never faced impossible choices. They've never had to decide between truth and safety, between honesty and survival. My husband faced such a choice, and he made the best decision he could with the information and resources he had. It was the wrong decision in many ways, but it was made for the right reasons." Edmund felt tears prick his eyes. She was defending him, not excusing him, but defending the impossible position he'd been in. "And do you believe he should retain his title and position?" the magistrate asked. "I do. Edmund Ashworth is the rightful Duke of Thornfield. He has proven his character through his actions, not the action of faking his death, but the actions of the 3 years that followed. He faced danger, he made restitution, he did everything he could to right his father's wrongs. That's not the behavior of a man committing fraud. That's the behavior of a man honoring his responsibilities in the only way he knew how." She stepped down, and Edmund wanted to go to her, to thank her, but the hearing continued. Marcus's solicitor presented their case that Edmund had committed fraud, that the legal declaration of death should stand, that the title should pass to Marcus as the designated heir. Marcus himself testified, painting Edmund as irresponsible and unstable, himself as the steady hand the estate needed. It was a compelling performance, Edmund had to admit. But then Mr. Harrington produced his trump card, the letter from the dying criminal confessing to the conspiracy against the Ashworth family. The letter detailed the threats made against Cecilia, the impossibility of Edmund's position, and the legitimate danger he'd faced. This man had no reason to lie, Harrington argued. He was dying, seeking to clear his conscience. His testimony corroborates everything the Duke has claimed. The magistrate studied the letter for a long time. The room fell silent, everyone waiting. Finally, Lord Justice Pemberton spoke. "This case hinges on a question of intent. Did Edmund Ashworth stage his death to commit fraud and escape his responsibilities? Or did he do so under extreme duress, with the intention of eventually returning once the danger had passed?" He looked directly at Edmund. "The evidence suggests the latter. While I cannot condone the method chosen, I can understand the desperate circumstances that led to such a choice. The threats were real, the danger was real, and the Duke's subsequent actions demonstrate a man committed to righting wrongs, not escaping them." Edmund felt his heart begin to pound. Therefore, I rule that Edmund Ashworth's legal death shall be overturned. He is restored to all rights, privileges, and responsibilities of the title Duke of Thornfield. His marriage to Cecilia Ashworth is and has always been valid and binding. The estate remains his, as does the title. The courtroom erupted. Marcus shot to his feet, face purple with rage, but his solicitor pulled him back down. Beatrice looked torn between relief and disappointment. Edmund turned to Cecilia and found her already looking at him. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. A real smile, the first he'd seen since his return. "We won," she whispered. "We won," he echoed. But he knew the real battle, the battle for their marriage, was just beginning. The celebration was muted but genuine. Back at the townhouse, Mr. Harrington joined them for a drink, pleased with his victory. Lady Catherine came by to offer congratulations, and other well-wishers followed. But eventually they were alone, just Edmund and Cecilia in the drawing room, the fire burning low, the evening stretching ahead. "Thank you," Edmund said quietly, "for what you said in court. You could have condemned me. Instead, you defended me." Cecilia set down her wineglass. "I told the truth. You hurt me, but you didn't do it out of malice. I needed the court to understand that." "And us? Do we tell the truth to each other now?" She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since his return. "What truth do you want to tell me, Edmund?" He took a breath, gathering his courage. "That I was a coward in our marriage. That I kept you at distance because I was afraid of what loving you would mean, afraid of the responsibility, the vulnerability, the risk of losing you. My father's secrets were already destroying me from the inside, and I thought if I never let you close, you couldn't be destroyed too. But I was destroyed anyway," she said softly, "just in a different way. I know, and if I could go back, I would do everything differently. I would let you in. I would trust you to stand beside me instead of trying to shield you. I would—" His voice broke. "I would love you the way you deserved to be loved." Cecilia stood, moving to the window. Outside, London glittered in the winter night, thousands of lights against the darkness. Would have, could have, should have. Those are the words of regret, Edmund, not of change. Then tell me what words you need to hear. I need to hear what you will do, not what you would have done, but what you're willing to do now, today, moving forward. Edmund stood, closing the distance between them carefully, giving her space to retreat if she needed it. She didn't move, just watched him with those gray eyes that had learned to see through pretense. "I will be honest with you, always," he said, "even when the truth is ugly or painful. I will consult you before making decisions that affect us both. I will never again try to protect you by keeping you in the dark." That's a start. What else? "I will court you." The words came out more passionate than he'd intended. "I will woo you like I should have before we married, like you deserved. I will learn what makes you laugh, what makes you feel safe, what dreams you've hidden away. I will earn your trust, and if I'm very lucky, someday I'll earn your love." Tears were sliding down her cheeks again. "And if you don't, if I can't give you what you're asking for, then I'll still stand beside you as your partner, your friend, your ally. I'll be whatever you need me to be, even if it's just the man who signs papers and manages the estate while you live your life however you choose." She let out a shaky breath. "That's not what I want." Hope flared in his chest. "What do you want?" "I want—" She stopped, gathering herself. I want to believe you've changed. I want to trust you again. I want to feel safe with you. But Edmund, I'm so tired of being hurt. I don't know if I can risk it again. Then don't. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hands in his. They were cold, trembling slightly. Don't risk everything all at once. Let's take this slowly. Let's learn to be friends first, partners second, and maybe, someday, lovers. We're already married, she pointed out, a ghost of humor in her voice. Then let's pretend we're not. Let's pretend we're just meeting, just learning about each other. No expectations, no demands, just two people seeing if they might fit together. Cecilia studied their joined hands. That's not how marriage works. No, he agreed, but ours has never been conventional. Why start now? That drew a real laugh from her. Small and watery, but real. You're ridiculous. I'm desperate, he corrected. There's a difference. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the war between hope and fear, between the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. All right, she said finally. We'll try. Slowly. But Edmund, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if I say stop, if I say I can't do this, you'll respect it. You won't push or manipulate or try to convince me. You'll just let me go. It was the hardest promise she could have asked for, but he gave it without hesitation. I promise. If you need me to step back, I will. Your happiness matters more than my own. She nodded, then gently extracted her hands from his. Then, let's start tomorrow. Tonight, I need to be alone, to think about everything that's happened. Of course. He stepped back, giving her space. Good night, Cecilia. Good night, Edmund. He left her standing by the window, silhouetted against the London night, and climbed the stairs to his separate chambers. It wasn't the reunion he'd dreamed of, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, he'd learned, were precious things, fragile and full of potential. He would nurture this beginning carefully, patiently, until it grew into something strong enough to hold the weight of their future. The following days established a new rhythm. They returned to Ashworth Manor, where the weight of their victory settled around them like a comfortable cloak. Marcus had retreated to London, defeated but not destroyed. He would no doubt continue to cause trouble where he could, but his claim to the title was finished. Edmund threw himself into estate management, working alongside Cecilia rather than above her. They spent hours in the study together, reviewing accounts, planning repairs, and slowly bringing the manor back to life. She was brilliant at the practical details he'd always neglected, and he found himself relying on her judgment more and more. But he was also courting her, true to his word. It started small, flowers left in her study, winter roses forced in the greenhouse, expensive but worth it to see her smile. Books he thought she'd enjoy, based on the ones he'd noticed her reading. Small repairs to things she'd mentioned were broken. A loose door handle, a squeaky floorboard, a window that wouldn't close properly. He asked her about her day over dinner, and actually listened to the answers. He learned that she'd started sketching during his absence, filling notebooks with drawings of the gardens and estate, that she dreamed of traveling to Italy someday, that she'd taught herself Italian from a grammar book, just in case, that her favorite time of day was just after dawn, when the world was quiet and full of possibility. In return, he told her about his time abroad, the terror of the first months, when every shadow seemed to hold a knife, the monastery where he'd hidden for a while, learning silence and contemplation from monks who asked no questions, the moment he'd finally tracked down the last of his father's creditors and realized he could come home. "Why did you wait 3 days before sending the letter?" she asked one evening. They were in the library, their place now, by unspoken agreement. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that you'd moved on, that you'd be better off without me. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to find out." "And if I had moved on?" Her tone was curious, not accusatory. If I'd remarried or built a life that didn't include you? Edmund considered the question seriously. Then I would have left again, quietly, legally. I would have made sure you were provided for and protected, and then I would have disappeared. Your happiness would have mattered more than my claim to anything. She studied him in the firelight. I think I believe you. Good, he smiled, because it's true. The weeks passed, winter deepening into January. They attended services together, walked the grounds together, planned the spring planting together. To the village and to visiting neighbors, they appeared to be a devoted couple reunited, and perhaps they were becoming that in their own careful way. But they still slept in separate chambers, still maintained a physical distance even as their emotional intimacy grew. Edmund was patient, never pushing, never pressing for more than she was ready to give. He'd learned the value of waiting, of letting things grow in their own time. Then came the night of the winter ball. Cecilia had insisted they host it, to formally celebrate Edmund's return and re-establish their place in county society. Edmund had agreed, though social events had never been his strength. Still, if it made her happy, he'd endure any number of balls. The manor was transformed for the occasion. Cecilia had worked miracles on a limited budget, using greenery and candles to hide the still damaged parts of the house and highlight the restored areas. The ballroom, which Edmund had thought beyond saving, had been cleaned and polished until it gleamed. "You're a miracle worker," he told her, the afternoon before the ball, finding her directing servants in the final preparations. She was flushed with exertion, a smudge of dust on her cheek, and had never looked more beautiful. "I'm a woman who refuses to be defeated by circumstance." That too. The evening of the ball, Edmund dressed with care in evening clothes that Thomas had somehow kept in perfect condition through all their travels. When he descended to the entrance hall, he found Cecilia waiting, and his breath caught. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that brought out the gray of her eyes and the fairness of her skin. Her dark hair was dressed elaborately with small diamonds, the Ashworth diamonds, he realized, another thing she'd kept safe through the years, catching the candlelight. She looked every inch a duchess. "You're stunning," he breathed. She blushed, actually blushed. "Thank you. You look rather handsome yourself." "Shall we?" He offered his arm, and she took it, and together they greeted their guests. The ball was a success by any measure. The county families came in force, curious and congratulatory. Lady Catherine was there with her husband, beaming with satisfaction at having backed the right side. Even some of Edmund's family came, distant cousins who'd always been kind, who expressed genuine joy at his return. Marcus, notably, did not attend. Edmund danced with Cecilia for the first waltz, as was traditional. As he took her in his arms, he was struck by how perfectly she fit, how right this felt.